Tales from the NYC Subway. Hello, my name is Bennett, and for the last 12 years, I have worked as an MTA employee for the New York City subway system. During that time, I've had a fairly substantial number of odd occurrences, reports, and stories happen on the job. The things I've seen and heard about down in the tunnels have always made for pretty good workplace banter, but I figured it would also be worth a shot to share some of the more unusual tales here. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Pretty much anyone who has ever ridden the NYC subway knows that there are some interesting characters down there. From doomsday prophets to men claiming to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. These guys can make for some of the most entertaining and or obnoxious parts of your day. Still, they're harmless enough, as long as you follow the general rule of thumb, which is to stare off into the distance and ignore them until they go away or reach your stop. You should be fine. With that said, I always have to warn tourists about some of the more malicious people you might run into in the tunnels. One of the more chilling stories I have is of the tall man in the bowler hat and overcoat. I will never forget that. I had only been working for the MTA for a year or so when he first appeared. I never got a good look at the guy. No matter what way you angled yourself to him, he always seemed to turn the other way, almost like he was on some kind of invisible pivot. Even more frustrating, the people that he did face were simply never able to recall any of his features. Whenever you would ask them, they would just say that they had not noticed the guy until the commotion began, and once that happened, it was too late to find him in the crowd. What you always did see, however, was the stubby bowler hat rested on his head, and the big, brown overcoat that extended from the nape of his neck all the way down to just above the heel of his shoes. What made the guy even more conspicuous was that he was always wearing the overcoat, no matter the time of day or weather. I mean, the first time I ever spotted him was in the middle of July. Not exactly the time of year for that line of clothing, if you ask me. The guy was also pretty damn tall. Nothing insane, but he was definitely over 6 feet tall, probably a little under 6.5. Anyway, the first time I saw the guy, I didn't make much note of him. I have to re-emphasize, you see a lot of strange people in the NYC subway on a good day, and even more so if you have to work there. I made a small mental note about how unusual his clothing was and how hot the guy must have felt, but not much else. Then, a minute or so later, he pushed a lady onto the tracks. The poor woman didn't even really have a moment to process what was happening. The guy spent a minute just leaning a little over the yellow line, listening for the oncoming subway. Then, once the rattle of the approaching train had gotten significantly louder, he just reached out one of his long, sleeved arms and swatted the lady next to him on the back. Hard. She yelled out as she hit the track, and then just a second or two later, the train hit. I did not see anything after she fell in, but a few of the other passers-by did. I was later told she landed on her back and that her arm flopped onto the live rail next to her. It's likely that she had already been electrocuted by the time she was run over, but we'll never really know. A metro takes a while to stop once the brake has been applied, so by the time it had come to a stop, there was nothing left to examine. When it happened, the whole platform erupted into pandemonium. You'd think they would have caught the guy right there, but he was just gone, vanished, and, like I said, no one remembered getting a good look at the guy. It was probably one of the worst days of my life. Even worse, that wasn't the last time it happened. Not even 6 months later, I spotted the back of the guy in the brown coat, walking through a turnstile. I ran up to catch him, but once I got over the turnstile, he had already melted away into the crowd. I didn't even see it happen. I just heard the yell, and then watched the crowd devolve into chaos. That time, it had been an elderly man. The guy was pushed into the side of a passing train. It broke his spine on impact, and he later died in the hospital. Again, the guy was not caught. That was the last time I ever saw him, but he did appear a few more times off my shift. He showed up 3 more times in the next 4 years, during which he killed 2 women and 1 little boy and seriously injured a middle-aged man. He appeared again around 3 years later, but the woman who was pushed that time acted quickly enough to scramble back up to the platform before the train had reached the station. Finally, he was last spotted about 3 years ago when he pushed a young man directly into the front of an oncoming train. The man was dead almost instantly. He hasn't been seen since, and I really hope, whoever he was, he's gone for good. On a lighter note, there have also been some amusing stories about weird people on the NYC subway. One that's always tickled my funny bone are the stories about the infamous Little Caesar. A few years ago, for the period of a few months, there were frequent reports coming in from passengers about a short man dressed entirely in the garbs of a Roman emperor. We're talking a toga, a laurel, and a sash, walking into the train, pacing up and down the entire length of the car, and reciting something in complete, fluent Latin for hours at a time. Most passengers would get off before him whenever he rode the train, but a few claimed he would always get off on one of the first stops in Upper Brooklyn. Honestly, we were pretty sad when we stopped hearing stories about Little Caesar. Those tales always lightened up the mood with us MTA workers. Most likely, he was just some prankster who really went the extra mile. One of the weirder phenomena actually has to do with MTA rules and regulations themselves. When I was first hired, I was told that it was imperative to count the number of subway cars and trains that stopped at our assigned stations, and to report that number to the workers at the next station. On the very first day, I asked an older worker why we did this. She then told me that it was fairly common for trains to leave one station with 1 or 2 more cars than they would have when they arrived at the next one. I thought she was bullshitting me, but throughout that whole first day, trains would pass by with fewer cars than the reports coming in from the previous station. Same for the trains that we would send to the next station. I'd later find out that the numbers they counted did not match up with ours. This has been happening pretty much the entire time I've worked for the MTA. Most of the time, a few cars have gone missing, though it's not uncommon for there to actually be more cars than were counted at the last station. The most bizarre part is that the varying number of cars never seems to get noticed by anyone else. As far as I know, there have never been any missing persons cases to come out of this phenomenon, and everyone who goes into the train eventually comes out. Even weirder, the numbers on the cars themselves are never missing. The sequence of cars, according to the numbers on their side, are always, without fail, completely uninterrupted. I assume that's why we employees are told to count them. Otherwise, no one would really notice. The only time a subway car has ever gone legitimately missing was about 5 years ago. This one still perplexes me. A group of passengers reported that they had been shuttling along one of the tunnels, when somehow, the car behind them, the last car on the train, became detached from their own car. Naturally, the passengers reported how stressed and afraid the people in that car had looked. We immediately radioed in what had happened and had the next train stop before reaching the tunnel. Luckily, the car was never hit. Unfortunately, it was also never found. We scoured that tunnel for the better part of 4 hours, but there's really only so much to do or say when an entire subway car has gone missing. I am still not sure what could have possibly happened to it. To this day, that entire car and all of the passengers on it are unaccounted for. One time, I caught a guy trying to smuggle live rabbits onto the train. I noticed a scrawny, shady-looking guy hop one of the turnstiles and walked over to talk to him. It's not at all uncommon to see people hop the turnstiles. Probably happens a few hundred times a day. This guy, however, looked really pale, gray, and nervous. he was also visibly sweating. I would have assumed he was on drugs if it wasn't for his bulging shirt and the little squeaks coming from all over his body. When I asked the guy what was going on, he just clammed up and stood there, did not move an inch. After a full minute of questioning him, I called over some other workers. At that point, the guy had tried to bolt back to the entrance, but he got grabbed by another MTA employee who had been heading over to the ruckus. We restrained him until the police arrived, and when they had him strip out of his shirt, he just had living rabbits strapped all over his torso. Seriously, the guy was absolutely covered in rabbits. You couldn't even see his bare skin underneath the squirming, squeaking mass of fur and flesh he had taped to his body. All of their mouths were bound shut with tiny bundles of rope that looped over their noses, and they had just been sort of taped to his skin. Once all of the rabbits had been removed, the police found his entire torso had been scratched up something fierce by the poor critters. To this day, I have no idea what the guy was doing with the rabbits, or why he had ever thought that this was a good way to transport them. Honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. One more story for now. Not too long after I had been hired, a man was accidentally separated from his daughter at my station. He had been holding her hand one moment, let go so he could tie a shoe, and then stepped onto the train as it pulled up. It was only when the doors were closing that he realized she hadn't actually followed him on board. You could see the panic on his face right as the car's doors slid shut. Luckily, one of my pals noticed what had happened and notified the subway operator. Of course, the train was on its way to the next station already, so there wasn't much more that we could do other than plan on transporting the kid to her father, or vice versa. But then, the kid let loose something astounding. Apparently, she wasn't even supposed to be with her father. The girl then told us that her parents had split up the previous year, and the court had denied her father custody and given him practically no visitation rights on the basis of his abusive tendencies. Her father had picked her up from her kindergarten class early that day and had been saying that he was going to bring her to the JFK airport so that they could live far, far away from her mother. The real reason the guy had looked so panicked in that moment, I suspect, was because he realized that he was about to be found out. We relayed what the girl had told us as quickly as we could, and he was arrested at the next stop. That day was a good day. Anyways, that's all I have to say for now. I have a whole lot more stories about the subway to tell, so if you all enjoy this, I'll probably be back with more. Additionally, if you have any questions or anything at all really, I'm happy to respond. Yo, back again. One of you asked me if I had any strange run-ins with the infamous New York rats. Obviously, the subway tunnels are absolutely infested with those little bastards. Typically, my relationship with the rats has always been one of mutual disregard. I don't like them, and they don't like me, and we don't acknowledge one another. It's not that I find them revolting, I just generally am not fond of them. Once you've seen a giant rat drag a Sicilian slice from one end of the tunnel to the other, you tend to lose your appetite. However, I did remember one specific instance where a group of rats acted rather erratically. Those of you who live in New York City yourselves might know that there are a marked difference between rats of different city districts. Brooklyn rats are distinct from rats in Queens or the Bronx, and even downtown Manhattan rats are pretty different from uptown Manhattan ones. One day on the job, I ran into a group of rats that didn't look anything like the ones from any of the 5 boroughs, however. These rats were fat little things, with hind legs that extended far beyond their tails. Their legs were bent upward in an unnatural fashion, appearing almost like a grasshopper's legs would. It was unnerving. Their fur was a stark white, tinged with a nauseating hue of yellow that made it look like each hair on the rats' bodies were beginning to decompose and fray at the ends. Their whiskers, too, ended in the same disgusting yellow. And their tails, they were this dark, bruised purple. It was as if they had earthworms crawling out from beneath them. I ran into a small cluster of them while patrolling the subway one night. I had the night to morning shift, so there weren't terribly many people in the tunnel at the time. Obviously, there is always a few people hanging around the NYC subway, even if they aren't necessarily taking the train. That was the case that night. There were a few homeless people scattered around. Usually, they stick close to the columns and corners of the subway platforms if they're just there for change or food. Otherwise, they'll stand with the others and wait for the train. Anyway, I ran into this cluster of weird-ass rats, right? Things were nasty little buggers. Everyone else in the tunnel were a few dozen feet away from them, at the least. It wasn't like they were straying away. I don't think anyone had actually noticed them. The rat things were all gathered around something on the floor. Their wide, grasshopper haunches up. They were all gnawing on something in the center of their cluster. I figured it was a slice of pizza or some scrap of food left behind by one of the previous passengers. I took my flashlight off of my belt and made as if to shoo them away. But they didn't. They didn't immediately leave, like other NYC rats would. Instead, they all froze at once. It was as if a singular collective command was spoken to them at the same time, and they all froze in exactly the same way at exactly the same time. Then, they all turned to face me. Their eyes were pale yellow, as if they were filled with a light noxious gas, and their teeth were far too long for their heads. Some of their incisors nearly met the ground, like a poor imitation of a rat-walrus hybrid. They sat there for maybe 5 seconds before all scuttling off at once. They ran down the side of the tunnel onto the tracks, and that was the last I've ever seen of those kinds of rats. When I looked down to see what they had been eating, I felt my blood turn to ice. It wasn't a slice of pizza at all. It was a human hand, half of it gnawed away to skeleton and sinew. Some flesh still clung in clumps to parts of it. The fingers were mostly untouched, but the rest were raggedy and torn. I immediately called it in, and the police arrived to check it out. They weren't able to find out when the hand had been torn from its body, but apparently it hadn't been long before I came across it. As far as I know, they never found a body, and they never named a suspect. I'm honestly not sure if it had even been a person who did it. After all, who is to say what those rats were and were not capable of? I'm not. I also got a question from an anon about out-of-place stairs in the subway tunnels. While I've never heard anything about stairs that weren't supposed to be where they were, I have heard some weird stories about stairs leading to the wrong place. I've never had this happen to me personally, but a few of my co-workers over the years have. They have sworn up and down that they've walked down a set of stairs that was supposed to lead to their assigned station, and somehow ended up in an entirely different section of the tunnels. Take Joey, for instance. Joey is one of my closest friends and co-workers, having worked with me now for about 10 years. I love the guy, but if I'm being honest, Joey is kind of a piece of soggy bread. He's not really one for jokes, and as long as I've known the guy, he has always been pretty serious about his job. Anyway, one day, Joey comes into work in this panicked state. He was late by nearly an hour and a half. I had never seen him as manic as I had that day. I asked him what was going on, and his response was almost entirely incomprehensible. It was just a string of nonsense with some occasional words sprinkled in. I told him to take a seat and calm down while I grabbed him a coffee. When I came back, he was significantly calmer and was able to actually speak real sentences, but he still looked freaked out. I asked him what was up, and this is what he told me. According to Joey, he had been going through his daily routine like normal, and was perfectly on time for a shift. At that time, we were assigned to a stop in Lower Manhattan. As he started walking down the steps to our station, he noted that it was darker in the tunnel than usual. He could not actually see the bottom of the staircase from the top. As he kept walking, and as it kept growing darker, he realized that he should have reached the bottom 10 or 20 steps ago. Then, the light from the surface vanished completely. Joey whipped around to see what had happened, and he was shocked to find that he could not see a thing. Then, said Joey, he raced back up the steps. This is where his explanation gets a little hard to describe. Somehow, in that dark corridor where Joey couldn't see his own hand in front of his face, he went from running upstairs to running downstairs. All of a sudden, the light from the tunnel was illuminating the staircase again, and he had somehow reached the bottom. Except he wasn't in the station he had started at. He was in a random stop in Brooklyn. And, even weirder, when he looked at his watch, nearly 20 minutes had passed by. Joey swore up and down that he had only been on that staircase for 2 minutes, tops. Normally, if someone told me this kind of yarn, I'd think they were trying to pull one over on me. But Joey never jokes. That's what makes this one worth telling. He is not the kind of guy to pull pranks, and from the way he had looked when he came into work, he didn't look like he was joking. A few other MTA workers, and even some passengers, have reported similar things over the years. Once or twice, someone will walk down a set of stairs and end up one station over from the one where they had entered, or at the station they had intended to take the train to in the first place, or just some completely random station. There's even been some talk of one woman walking down a flight and just never reappearing, but I can't confirm that one. Still, it is not something I would immediately discount. Oh, I remembered another weird guy I would see in the tunnels every once in a while. This guy has been around well before since I started working here, and he still shows up occasionally. I'm just gonna call him Guitar Guy. Guitar Guy is just, well, he is interesting, I'll give you that. When I first saw him, I thought he was some sort of wannabe shock act that had wandered in from Times Square. He was wearing nothing but a pair of underwear, and a guitar strapped onto his bare chest. He looked just like the Naked Cowboy, if you've ever seen him around the city, so I naturally assumed he was just some copycat looking to get attention. I moved to go over and kick the guy out, but then all of the other MTA workers stopped me and said that I should let him stay and play a song. I thought they were pulling my leg, but I decided to stop and see what Guitar Guy was capable of. I'm glad I did too. When he started strumming the strings of his instrument, the air around him seemed to sort of shimmer. It was as if God himself had turned up the saturation and brightness of the very space Guitar Guy inhabited, because all of a sudden, this guy looked beautiful. It was like he walked right out of a Salvador Dali painting or something. Everyone around him, passengers, some homeless folks, and even a few of us workers, stopped what they were doing and looked at him, a sense of awe sketched onto their faces. He sang a song, and it was just gorgeous. I wish I could describe what it was like, but I can't, because I don't remember. I've heard this song some 20 or 30 times during my career, but I can't for the life of me ever recall it once I've heard it. All I know is that it sounds amazing, and that I always grow more excited once I see him. I don't think I've ever seen him do anything other than walk in, play his guitar, and then leave. Never seen him talk. Never seen him get onto a train. Now that I think about it, he looks pretty much exactly like he did the first day I saw him. It's like he doesn't even age. Ask anyone from MTA about Guitar Guy, and they'll probably just get a big old smile on their faces. Finally, I did a little bit of digging on the guy in the bowler hat and big overcoat. You guys really seem to want to hear more about him, so I headed over to the New York Public Library to look for anything that caught my eye, and what I found honestly shocked me. I used the computer search near the front desk to find any matching text to my description of the guy, but besides a few red herrings and some fictional novels, I wasn't able to find anything. Then, I headed over to the microfilm readers and asked the librarian for help looking through older New York newspapers. I probably spent 5 whole hours scouring those papers, but I found something. Obviously, there were mentions of the guy and a description of what he was wearing from all of the recent instances that I mentioned. But I also found something that I don't think anyone else has. I was looking over an old newspaper copy that was published March 3rd, 1957. I honestly can't even believe that I spotted this. It was so out of the way. The headline of the weekend edition of the New York Post read, "Music Man opens to applause at Majestic Theater." But I was far more intrigued on the front page sidebar. Just a small snippet of an already obscure part of the paper. Mystery man pushes child onto subway tracks, causes commotion. On this day, at approximately 4:30 p.m., a mystery individual pushed 10-year-old Charlie Jones onto the tracks at the Times Square 42nd Street subway station. The individual was unfortunately not apprehended and has not yet been spotted by the authorities, but Jones did fortunately survive, thanks in no small part to his quick thinking and reflexes. Young Charlie grabbed the edge of the platform and lifted himself back up, only moments before the oncoming train entered the station. When questioned about the man who slipped away during the resulting commotion, Charlie could only say this: he was really tall, and he had a funny round hat on. I didn't see his face. He was covering it with the part of his jacket that comes around his neck. It was a really long coat too. I hope they can catch the guy. Honest, I'm really sorry that I couldn't catch his face. If you have any information regarding this dangerous individual, please be sure to contact. The rest of the article went over the standard fare of the Times. In fact, there wasn't any mention of him in the rest of the issue, or in any other papers that came out the same day. Trust me, I checked. And then, I pored over all of the issues of that paper to come out in the next few months. Nothing. I asked the rather frustrated librarian if they could call me if they heard or saw anything in other papers after that date regarding the man. I haven't gotten any calls yet. It might be that the librarian just decided that they had enough to do and didn't do it. I guess that would be fair. Either way, I'll be back soon to look more at the papers. That was 66 years ago. 66 years, and then presumably nothing. And then boom, back again. No explanation, no differences from before. I want to believe that it's a coincidence or someone else following in the original's footsteps, but I'm not sure that is the case. Who else could have seen this besides me? I barely was able to find anything, and I was actually looking for it. Here's a story that I've never shared before. It's not really paranormal, but it scares the living shit out of me. 17 years old. Been smoking weed regularly with a couple of guys from college. I'm from the UK. We start college at 16, for a year now. One of the guys usually drives, and we smoke up in this field that's deserted at night. Driver gets a call from someone. He starts freaking out, literally laying on the floor, screaming down the phone. Never heard screaming like that before. It was fucking terrifying. He's not even making sense. He's like writhing around on the floor and screaming down the phone. Starts doing this weird fucking laughing, all bug-eyed and weird. Calmly puts his phone in his pocket. Climbs a very tall fence for a tennis court. Jumps off, lands on his neck, and fucking kills himself. Guy I hung around with every day for a year just ups and takes his own life because of a phone call, and none of us know who it was on the other end. I wish I was making this up, but it fucked me up for a while afterwards. The other guy we were with started using ketamine regularly. We are both 21 now, and he's completely screwed in the head. I was on medication for a while afterwards, shitty citalopram, but came off it quickly. The police put it down to a stoned idiot climbing the fence. They interviewed us both once, and that was it. I never even heard from his family. They moved out of the county pretty quickly. I still have his younger brother on Facebook. I've buried the memory somewhere in my brain and just tried to ignore it. But whenever my phone rings and I don't have the number saved, then I always get a horrible feeling and I never answer. I'm not even explaining how fucking weird this guy was acting when he answered his phone. It was horrible. The fucking noises he was making were so fucking disgusting. I can't even try to explain it, because it just makes me feel physically sick. I don't know what the fuck happened that day. Did the Alamos abduct me or what? Be me. Clean my bedroom meticulously. Change my bedclothes too. Finally I take a shower and get ready to sleep. I fix my sheets, blankets, and cover around me to sleep, as if I were in a cocoon. Fall asleep. Suddenly I wake up, because I listen to steps in my room. I open my eyes, and there were 3 tall, skelly-looking people with masks. They didn't feel like humans. I am scared as fuck. I think this is a nightmare, so I close my eyes very hard, because that's usually how I'm able to wake up when I'm in a nightmare. Shit doesn't work, but I still don't open my eyes, because those things look scary as heck. I pretend that I'm sleeping. I try to take a peek, and shit again. Of course they know I'm not, because they are still looking at me in front of my bed. Uh-oh. Then I'm feeling like levitating, and leaving my room through the window of my room. Now I'm lying on something metallic. I open my eyes, and there were those fuckers. I lose consciousness. I wake up in my bedroom, still wrapped like a cocoon. I freak out, because my anus hurts so much. I check my clothes, underwear, skin, and everything seems normal. What the fuck happened?